Recording.
Hello, everyone. I'm David Connolly, a member of the ACRL staff. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar offered as part of ACRL's Together Wherever virtual event. Our goal for these webinars is to bring our colleagues together to discuss ways to best meet the needs of the library community during this uncertain time and beyond. As you may be aware, academics today are being asked to pause their teaching, research, and service activities as part of #ShutdownAcademia and #ShutdownSTEM. Our ACRL Together Wherever programming is being offered in support of education and action in response to ongoing systemic anti-Black racism and Black Lives Matter. Thank you for joining us as we learn, grow, and enact change as a community. If you'd like, feel free to say hello to your fellow attendees in the chat box with a brief introduction of yourself while I go over a few reminders. I will also be here to monitor the chat and moderate the questions at the end of the session for presenters. As previously mentioned, today's session is being recorded. A link to the recording will be added to the ACRL Together Wherever website when the recording is available. The ALA Statement of Appropriate Conduct applies to all ACRL events, including virtual, and we encourage respectful discourse about this session on Twitter using #ACRLTogether2020. Today's presentation will be 1 hour in length, and we'll leave the Zoom room open for additional 20 minutes after the presentation for those who would like to continue the conversation with additional networking and questions. When you choose to depart today's session, you'll see a brief evaluation, and we greatly appreciate your thoughts and feedback. Thank you in advance. Today's webcast is Everyday Inclusion Begins with Me, Diversity and Intergroup Communication in the Workplace. I'd like to thank our presenters, Aubrey Iglesias, Pambanisha Whaley, and Jana Alabi for being with us today. And with that, I give you today's program.
Thank you, David, for the introductions. Can everybody hear me? My name is Aubrey Iglesias. All right, wonderful. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be in the world. I'm so happy to be with you today with my fellow panelists. I'm coming to you today from New Mexico State University in Las Cruces, southern New Mexico, from the New Mexico State University's Branson Library, Technical Services Department, conference room. So thank you so much for joining us today. By going through our work days in an automatic way without reflection and just continue to do what we've been doing is contributing to us not advancing as a profession. So for a while, I and others that are like me are benefiting from the current system, many others are experiencing barriers and feel excluded. So the time to start to change is today and every day. So the pandemic and the economic crises have really ripped off the Band-Aid, so to speak, and really shown how entrenched inequities are in the United States. So this is a dire situation. Today, when we're going through the presentation, the webinar, and we encourage you to take notes, creating an action plan for yourself of what actions you are going to be taking in your workplace to hopefully create a more inclusive environment for everybody. So here's a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to continue with introduction, then I'll be speaking about intergroup communication. Then Pambanisha will be speaking about mentoring, formal and informal. Then microaggressions will be spoken about by Jana. Towards the end, we're going to have conversations with participants. I hope you'll join us. And I just want to say thank you to my fellow panelists and also for Jana for adding a lot of additional information at the very end of the slides, including a long anti-racism book list. So the current, right now, academic librarians, according to, I think it was in 2012, the Diversity Counts report was that 86.1% of higher education librarians are white. And this number has been high for a long time, staying roughly in that range over the last many years. And there's a disconnect between the librarians and the students that we serve. So currently, the student demographics they come from very diverse backgrounds. And that's just going to be continuing to increase in the coming years. So we need to reflect more, the professional librarians need to reflect more of the student populations that we serve. So there are lots of benefits to working with diverse groups. And here are 3 studies that's been cited a little bit in the literature. According to Page, that diverse groups can outperform very able groups. So he did a study in which he assumed that the students in one of his classes, the very able group, would be able to outperform a group of students who were not in the class, and were very diverse in their from the demographics, and smart people. So he thought, okay, we'll have both. Well, the research found out that the more diverse group actually was more successful in completing the task, finding and coming to the conclusions that were posed. But 4 conditions had to be met that I've included below. The problem needs to be difficult. Everyone needs to be able to have the ability to solve problems, and there must be diversity among problem solvers, as well as more than a handful of people need to be involved, drawn from a large population. And another study from Summers from 2006, there were mock jury groups. They did this trial to see how different the composition of different groups would do. So one of the groups was white, all white, and the other group was made up of jury members who were of white and also additional diverse ethnicities and backgrounds. And so what they found is that actually the group that was more diverse did had the deeper discussions, came out with more valuable information, talked more about race and how it related to the case that they were looking at. So, and then when the group of whites were talking to each other, when race was brought up, that was pretty much ignored and moved forward in the process, but they didn't get to the depth that the group that had diverse participants did. So another study was with Phillips and their team in 2009, in which she brought in people from the same like sorority or fraternity, and also an outsider to that group. And they were tasked with trying to solve a murder mystery. And then different groups assembled. So there were at times 2 from people who knew each other with a diverse other. And the stranger, was given additional information that would help solve the crime. And when they were given that information was communicated to the other 2 members. But when that additional information was given to one of the 2 people that knew each other, it wasn't communicated to the other. So how does it feel? So we're talking about people experiencing barriers and perceiving to be excluded from the group. What does rejection or feel like, right? So according to this study, students were at computer stations and they thought they were playing virtual ball game, that they were receiving the ball and tossing it in a virtual environment. And the researchers were looking at their brains, and then later on, the person wasn't being given the ball, was being excluded from this virtual game of catch. And so the researchers found that when they're looking at the brain, the areas lit up that were dealing with with physical trauma, associated with physical trauma. So if we're not including other people, if we're doing things that exclude them from our group, from our discussions in the workplace, there are not only psychological ramifications, but also and physical as well that can be experienced. So intergroup communication, we talked about some of the positives that can happen when people from diverse groups come together and communicate. But why is it so hard? Why are sometimes do we find it so hard to do? And part of this is because naturally, biologically, we can be attracted to people that look like us. They're similar of background. And according to evolutionary psychologists, in fact, that in general, so intergroup hostility is actually biologically inherited. So we have we have an implicit intergroup bias where that we connect easier with people from our own group as opposed to people from another group as a kind of a survival mechanism. So while that is biologically has been found to be in every one of us, the good thing is that it's malleable. With experience, with being in different contexts, such as with positive interactions with diverse others, and knowing simply about this implicit intergroup bias can help us to mitigate these issues. So a lot of people say, I'm not biased, or I'm not prejudiced because XYZ, I don't do some overt act, right? Like say a group's superior to another, or I don't know, advocate for segregation in schools. But the thing is, if we are biologically inclined to work more with people of our own group. So what happens with this implicit intergroup bias is, if you don't realize it's there and don't take actions to mitigate its effects, what happens is that your behaviors are influenced by this bias. So you say one thing, but you're really doing something else that is continuing the systemic problems. And I realize I'm really oversimplifying this, and I'll try to hurry because I know that we have a lot to talk about today. So basically, when we're talking about implicit intergroup bias, what we're thinking about is how groups socialize. So intergroup relations, so people that are from different groups that are communicating, as opposed to people in the same group, intragroup, from the same backgrounds communicating together. So what happens is it's a process of social categorization, and we can belong to different types of social groups, not just racial, but ages, from different ages and different nationalities and whatnot. And they've found that, I'm gonna go ahead and move this really quick. So a sense of social identity comes out between people from the same group. A cooperation happens more, whereas people from different groups, the tendency is to compete against each other. And this kind of goes back to if you're thinking about like hunter and gatherer societies in which it's all about survival. So in general, the tendency is to favor the in-group members, people in your own group, and be wary of other groups outside yours. So it's a survival mechanism. So what happens after the mind socially categorizes this person is that stereotyping gets added onto that. And this is basically serves a really cognitive energy saving function. And it also comes down to this survival in some respect, because we need to quickly assess if there's a dangerous situation, et cetera. And so a problem with this is if for certain things such as race and religion, what happens is a tribal intergroup, these tribal intergroup contexts is what psychologists call them. And what happens is that when people categorize themselves by these types of groups, what they are ascribing threat. So there are some stereotypes that that are threatening in nature, and I'm trying to hurry and move forward with this faster. So if that happens, if you are worried, you assume that this group is threatening, what can happen is you assume aggressive intentions on that person is trying to do to you when that's not the case. So an example here is with this functional projection, that people may tend to perceive anger in outgroup members of people that are not in the group, especially in terms of males, even if the males have a neutral expression. So how do we reduce our implicit bias and reduce prejudice? An individually oriented way, according to DeVito and Gertner, is simply to uncover the inconsistencies between people's self-images, how they present themselves to the world, and their values and their behaviors. So has anyone taken the project Implicit tests? I found that these are very, very enlightening. So basically you can take tests and you can see how fast you react to certain images of people and how you associate them with positive and negatives. Can show how your bias, the range of how biased you are towards a certain group or whatnot. So reducing prejudice in an individual-oriented way, uncovering these inconsistencies, which lead to feelings of guilt and hopefully result in motivating someone to change their attitudes and intergroup behavior, as well as control spontaneous stereotypical responses. Another strategy is in terms of bringing people together to work together in intergroup strategies. Simply that intergroup conflict may be reduced if these four factors come into play. And I put these two sets up with DeVito and Gertner as well as Allport, because they're very similar, just using a little bit different words. But so according to Park and Hunt, Allport's 1954 contact hypothesis is really the basis for subsequent interventions on improving intergroup, reducing prejudice among people of diverse backgrounds working together. So these four areas have to be there. Ideally, equal status, pursue the same goals, opportunities to get to know each other, and support of authorities. And now, if all of these come into play, there's really no differences between the groups, but just having one or two or more of these factors in place makes a big difference for successful or a positive intergroup work. And then something else I want to mention really quick is that we're looking further at these factors, intergroup contact reduction, and these four factors, what it comes down to is getting rid of those separations in the social categorization. So such as for decategorization, when people are working with diverse others, they can, they'll see somebody as an individual and not have those stereotypes that can sometimes be negative with their group influence their relationship with that person. And another way to decategorize, an example of decategorization is when two people are exchanging information that's intimate in nature. It's not just how's the weather, but something of more substance. It can really also, the person can see the other one from another group as not being a separate, as being an individual and not just associated with those negative stereotypes. Another way is decategorization, seeing people in a different social category. This might be creating like a subordinate group instead of separate groups, finding that common uniting, finding that common goals, that cooperative intergroup interactions goes a long way for recategorizing. I'm going to just move forward because I think that the time is going by really fast. And this is a really big topic, and I wish I had more time. So specifically, how can we be more inclusive in academic libraries, and one way in terms of implicit intergroup bias, when we're doing meetings, make them more inclusive. Try to incorporate those 4 factors for intergroup work as much as possible. And I won't read through all of these right now, but basically you want to make sure that everybody's able to speak, that somebody's assigned to make sure that everybody's voice their opinions, etc. And I'm going to move this forward to Jana. Thank you, Jana. We'll talk about mentoring.
I think actually we're going to have Pam Benicia cover mentoring.
I am so sorry, Pam Benicia, my nerves are getting to me.
No worries. Good morning, everyone. So we're going to, if we could advance to the next slide. Just going to ask you to take a moment to maybe think about the organization that you're currently in, or maybe an organization from your past, and just look at these questions. Think about the formal and informal groups that existed. Think about how, which groups you belong to, how those groups came to be. Hopefully, if you're able to stick around at the end, we'll be able to kind of discuss this a bit. Who was included in the groups? Who was excluded? Was it on purpose? Just think about that, and think about the ways that impacts communication, teamwork, just the work that your organization was able to do. And then we have a few more additional thoughts. Are there certain people that suffer when they speak? Do certain people only get the opportunities to do things? Are they pigeonholed, etc.? I hope that just taking a little bit of time to think about the groups that exist in your organization, and I hope this is something you'll do more often than just this moment, might give you a brief glimpse into how successfully your organization manages interaction, inclusion, and maybe it might also give you a glimpse into some of the ways that bias, conflict, and just basic discord can reduce your ability to communicate effectively with everyone. I also hope that whatever answers you sort of give to these questions would make you think about who could be included and how you might actively attempt to sort of participate in that. So in this situation, I'm sort of choosing to think about mentoring beyond the notion of just, advising and training. Library literature, we cover peer training, we think about formal, informal, things directly related to your job. But at its base level, really mentoring is just a way to share information about the organization. Either someone is new and you're attempting to, I want you to know everything that you can possibly know so you can be as successful as you can possibly be. Of course, that's the onboarding process. Those are job-related skills. All of those things connect to aiding retention. But at the end of the day, we're creating connections. If done effectively, our mentoring relationships are going to create connections, that strengthen how we can understand each other. They're going to allow us to think beyond our own experiences. They're going to help us really work together as the types of cohesive teams that Aubrey mentioned earlier. And I would really sort of like to propose, I have had the honor of sort of working with a group of colleagues where we were really interested in the notion of psychosocial mentoring. And as you see, those are sort of the aspects of a relationship, enhance the sense of competence, clarity of identity, and effectiveness in a professional role. I personally can think of so many points in my professional life where I've been able to have a person. I had something like that in undergrad, definitely in graduate school. I entered the profession as a library resident, and I was fortunate enough that the resident, our coordinator, was just the epitome of this. So he was very, very interested in ensuring that I knew what I needed to know about the organization, but he was also interested, we'd start our meetings off and he would say, do you need a car place? You're new to the town. What can I do to help you fit to help you have all the things that you had previously, so you can focus on your work. So for me, it's really creating a relationship with someone, a meaningful relationship, not a forced relationship. We're not asking, try to become someone's friend necessarily. I know a lot of people are bothered by the notion of psychosocial mentoring because they think you're sort of saying you have to be this person's friend, and they think of that as unprofessional. It's really not that. It's you figuring out how you can positively impact a person's experience, how you can serve as a supportive colleague. That may mean helping them find a dry cleaner. It may mean talking about the difficulties they're having as they experience the organization. But I think the foundation of it is that type of mentoring, the depth of it, the connections that are formed allow both individuals to experience trust. And the strength of that trust is something that is very important for equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts. And, as our group was talking, again, as Aubrey said, it felt like there's so many things that you could talk about. But we're sort of trying to find a way to sort of synthesize everything and start this conversation, continue a conversation that many other people have engaged in. So when we're talking about sort of fixed and growth mindset, as we think about mentoring, as we think about onboarding, as we think about inclusion, I think it's sort of a helpful way to interrogate how you think about others. So I just want to say there's no way we're using this framework to minimize the ways like bias and racism negatively affect our organizations. We're not just saying if I have a growth mindset, I can sort of ignore all of that. We're saying sort of think about how you think about both yourself and other people, how that affects what support you offer them in the organization, how you engage with people, how you perceive them. Is your own maybe negative self-talk, sort of thinking that there's a static amount of abilities that you have? Does that affect the way that you deal with other people? And then when coupled with bias or other things, intentional or unintentional, does that keep you from being able to engage with your colleagues in a way that helps both you and them have a growth mindset, think about developing additional skills in the organization, and just doing the growth and connections that we need to be, the best organizations we can possibly be. So when sort of the things we've discussed don't occur, I listed one because if I didn't list one, I would list like 90. We know that our literature is filled with examples of the things that happen when we aren't able to communicate, when we're unwilling to listen to people, when bias interrupts our ability to work together with our fellow librarians, with our fellow library employees. And I sort of focus on stereotype threat right now, just because it's one that I think is so tightly tied to the way we communicate. So if you're constantly telling, a colleague that you don't think they can do as good of a job as other people, or you don't think they're up to whatever task it is you're working on as an organization, that directly affects that person's ability to participate. It actually makes that person perform at a lower level. It connects back to the slide that Aubrey shared with the actual pain that happens. To me, if nothing else, just thinking about the way you speak about people, you can diminish the level of the work that they're able to do. And I think that's an unfortunate thing that happens within our profession. And it can definitely be reduced when people know that they're working with someone that has high standards. So it's not the notion of, well, I'm lowering my standards in order to let this person in. No, you have high standards. It's knowing that people believe that you can achieve those standards, and then being fair and clear as they mentor you, as you work together to meet those goals together. So sort of we talked as a group, and these are just ways, you know, our title is Everyday Inclusion Begins With Me. So again, often with mentoring, with these EDI related things, we think of it as something that might be top down. And really there's ways for all of us. If you're a supervisor or a manager, I really think one of the best things that you can do is exactly, you know, the previous slide. Make it clear that you believe in people, make it clear and honestly, you know, not just something you say. Definitely advocate for training opportunities. Learn the strengths of the people that you work with. I think that's one of the most important things. If you know what their strengths are, you can definitely counter anything that might be a perceived weakness, but you can also look for opportunities that will allow you to engage people in projects that will speak to their strengths. And in the end, allow us to have those types of groups that we were mentioning earlier. Again, clearly communicating your standards, making sure your bias doesn't interfere with your appraisal of someone. And I think one of the most amazing things you can do definitely as a manager or supervisor is working with people. So presenting, publishing, be it internal or external, working on projects. That's another way to sort of let people know, I believe in you, you know, you're able to do this, and use whatever power you have as a supervisor or manager to uplift your team. And that's indeed, you know, and also sort of all of, you know, all of your actions, all of your words. And then for everyone else in the organization, just the sort of speaking up in meetings, not leaving people in sort of uncomfortable situations, and then maybe after the meeting telling them, oh, that was horrible. You know, once you let certain types of behaviors occur in an organization, they become the norm, they become accepted. The culture is changed because those things continue to happen. So it's very important, sort of each of us has the ability to sort of affect that. Also sort of stopping inappropriate conversations. There may be things that people say that it's not overtly racist, but it's still sort of diminishing the potential of another person, you know, for no reason. Also amplifying ideas. So, you know, if you see that there's someone that's often sort of unheard, you know, maybe a group of you, of your colleagues can amplify what they're saying, ensure that they're heard, and not just leaving them to sort of fall into the hole of just never being heard and feeling excluded. And then also just, you know, removing your zero-sum thinking. So like I'm not in competition with any of my colleagues. Each of them comes to the table with, you know, amazing skills, amazing abilities, whatever their weaknesses are, whatever my weaknesses are, we're working together to be a successful team so we can have a powerful organization that works together well. And then again, you know, the same that I sort of said for managers, no matter who you are, you have power in the organization, and there's someone that has less power than you. You can look out for people, you can be there, you can stand up when things are wrong, and together you'll be able to sort of make a better organization that hopefully is more inclusive.
And that kind of transitions us into microaggressions, because when we're mentoring, when we're interacting with our colleagues, it's really important for us to just be acutely aware that oftentimes what we intend to say is not necessarily what actually gets communicated. In particular, microaggressions is an instance when this happens along power and privilege lines. So microaggressions are subtle, denigrating messages conveyed to people from marginalized groups. They're often delivered unconsciously or unintentionally. They can be directed actually toward any marginalized group. So it can be based on race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, religion, disability, class, etc. The list goes on. For the discussion today, I'm going to focus on racial microaggressions. And so now we have a really common microaggression that I would like for you guys to take a second and try to think about what's the problem with this statement. And you can, you know, type into the chat box. But let's say the setting is that you're on an airplane, you know, pre-pandemic, you turn to your seatmate who's a person of color, you're asking them where they're from, and they're like, oh, I'm from Arkansas. And you're like, no, where are you really from? What's the issue with that? So some of your comments are, it's dismissive, it's kind of an us versus them mentality. It's an effort to categorize and quote other, to want a perpetual foreigner. Yeah, that's the message that's being sent here. You don't belong. So if we can go to the next slide, this is kind of how I've interpreted that, right? Is I'm saying, you've told me where you're from, but I'm like, no, that's not actually what I'm after, but I don't want to say what I'm actually after, which is maybe your racial or ethnic background. But also I'm telling you that the place that you've said you're from doesn't fit. You don't look like what I think somebody from that place looks like. So I'm basically telling you that you're wrong. And so if you're doing if you're looking at a lot of the literature, Daryl Wing-Sue and his colleagues would sort of group this into the theme of perpetual foreigner. So it doesn't, or alien in one's own land. So yeah, it doesn't matter that you have lived here your entire life. Somebody's telling you that you don't belong here. So I wanted to share with you just a very brief timeline of some of the research on microaggressions. I will say that these are just some highlights that I have selected that I think are important. There's a ton more research out there, especially in the past 10-ish years. There's been a ton. But the term was coined in 1970, Chester Pierce. At that time, psychiatrists were really focused on defensive mechanisms that help to prevent you from feeling shame or guilt. Pierce actually ends up sort of turning that a little bit and focusing on offensive mechanisms. And those are the things that sort of enact or inform or enforce feelings of racial superiority of whites over blacks. And from his definition, he's saying that most offensive actions aren't gross and crippling, they're subtle, stunning. These are blows that are delivered incessantly. And hence the therapist is obliged to pose the idea that offensive mechanisms are usually a microaggression as opposed to a gross, dramatic, obvious macroaggression. And he ends up doing a lot more work with that and looking at how blacks are portrayed in TV commercials versus whites. So black women, black men, white women. So some really fascinating work there. In 1989, Peggy Davis writes about the law as microaggression. So she is talking about a survey that was commissioned by the National Center for State Courts that reported that minority people reported feeling that the law would not work to their advantage, that the law would actively work to their disadvantage. And she's kind of trying to explain why there were these results of the survey. And what she comes up with, or her explanation, is because American racism is so pervasive and largely unconscious, it's just baked into the system. So we don't have to do anything. Racism just permeates everything. And so even though we like to think of the legal system as being neutral and unbiased, it completely is not. 1998, Daniel Solorzano looks at Chicano and Chicana scholars. So he's bringing gender into the discussion of racial microaggressions. And he's also employing critical race theory, which I think we're seeing a lot more of now. One of the tenets of that is going to be that race is central to any discussion. It's not peripheral, it's not an add-on. And also there's an emphasis on counter narratives. So using the words of the people that have been marginalized. 2007, we have Daryl Wing-Sue and his colleagues who work on creating a taxonomy. So they're trying to classify and delineate how microaggressions occur, how they're conveyed, the themes that they convey. The idea being that if you can't name it and pin it down, then it's really easy. Well, it's not, you can't address it. You can't fix it. You can't study it. You can't correct it. 2011, we have Kevin Nadal, who creates a racial and ethnic microaggression scale. So trying to gauge the prevalence of microaggressions that people of color experience in everyday life. 2015, Chandra Forrest Bank and Jeffrey Jensen are looking at the differences of microaggressions experienced among a sample of young adults. So they're Asian, Latino, Black, and white young adults. All of the non-white young adults experience the same level or amount of microaggressions. It's just that different themes, different messages were more prevalent for some groups than others. And all of the non-white young adults reported more microaggressions than the white young adults. That's not shocking. 2018, we have Amy Thurber and Robin D'Angelo. D'Angelo, whose name you probably know from White Fragility. But so they have an article where they're talking about, and we'll get into that a little bit more in just a second, but they're looking at kind of answering that question of, okay, microaggressions are a problem, but like, what do we do? How do we handle them? And so they have some principles that we'll talk about in just a second. I did want to say though that there has been some criticism of Sue and his structure for microaggressions. He kind of classifies them in terms of micro assaults, which are kind of akin to old-fashioned racism. They're very blatant, very obvious. The intent is to harm someone. And then micro insults, which are more like subtle snubs, kind of backhanded compliments, and then micro invalidations, where you're invalidating the experiences of people of color. So like espousing a colorblind philosophy, that would be an example of a micro invalidation. And these last two are really more subtle. And I think right now, when we look at what we're seeing in the world, we have a lot more obvious, blatant, overt racism happening. So these do sort of exist along a continuum. And some researchers have said we really need to, if we're going to talk about microaggressions, we should really just focus on the more subtle pieces of it instead of the blatant, obvious micro assaults. I will note that micro here doesn't mean small. It really means interpersonal as opposed to institutional or systemic racism. But more importantly, how do we intervene in these? What do we do? So Thurber and D'Angelo have sort of broken it down to what if you're the target of a microaggression? They say they really emphasize your first responsibility is to yourself. You don't owe a response to anybody. But they do encourage, if you're the target of a microaggression, to acknowledge, affirm what you're feeling, take time to recenter. That recentering can be physical activity, cultural, spiritual, ritual, talking it through with others who share your identity or an understanding ally, journaling, quiet reflection. Then thinking about what is it that you want to see happen and what are some strategies that you might be able to use to achieve that goal moving forward. And if you choose to, you can reclaim your voice by speaking up to the aggressor, you can enlist allies, you can seek support from affinity groups, you can start a campaign or political action. So there are some options for that. And I will say the reason that Thurber and D'Angelo are looking at principles for intervening is they're very explicit. It so much depends on the context that you're in, and there is no one right way to kind of answer or respond to these situations. As a witness, some things to think about. So what is the cost of not responding? What message are you sending to the people around you? If you are, if you try to consider yourself an ally and you're not responding in this situation, you're sending a definite message to people that you were hoping to ally yourself with. You also should think about your goal or purpose. Are you trying to shift the understanding or the actions of the perpetrator? Are you trying to provide support or stand in solidarity with the target? Are you trying to raise consciousness of other bystanders around you? Thurber and D'Angelo also come from more of a social work background. So they really emphasize compassion and empathy. But also they say that doesn't mean letting somebody off the hook. But they really emphasize calling in rather than calling out. So a calling in is an invitation to reflect on your behavior and the effect of your behavior. And as a perpetrator, this is maybe a little bit more difficult, I think, for some of us to think about. I'm sure a lot of us have been in this position. I know I have. So it's definitely important to face oppressive patterns, thinking about stereotypes, prejudices that you may hold. So again, that Project Implicit kind of test is a great example of ways to kind of bring that to the forefront for yourself. being open and receptive to feedback. So my colleague Alana Moore has mentioned before that if somebody points out that you have said or done something racist, you should really treat it the same way that you would if somebody has told you that your zipper is down or you have spinach in your teeth. You thank them for letting you know, and you know, get the spinach out of your teeth or zip up your pants, right? Not reacting with anger or defensiveness. Also recognizing that accountability is a process. So it's not just, there's not a checklist that you can just go through and you're done. It's a continuous process. And they also encourage seeking restorative action. And the purpose here is not about getting forgiveness or seeking some sort of reassurance. It's really about ameliorating the oppression that you've engaged in. So that process includes acknowledging your conduct, your action, stating a plan for how you can do better, inviting the person that has been affected by your behavior to talk about that, how they've experienced it, and then offering an opportunity to find out if there's anything else that needs to be said or heard so that you guys can move forward. Also, more recently in 2019, Sue and his colleagues are at it again. And this time they're looking at micro-interventions. So I really encourage you to take a look at this article. So microaggressions are kind of everyday words or deeds that convey derogatory messages. Micro-interventions are the everyday words or deeds that provide support or validation or encouragement or reassurance to people of color that what they're experiencing is real. So Sue and his colleagues have, they talk about some of the different strategic goals of micro-interventions. And so those are kind of making the invisible visible. So just with that thought bubble that we had earlier, or the chat bubble and the message that's conveyed under it, you want to make the invisible visible. So you can undermine that sort of, they call it a meta communication. You can name that meta communication. So you can say like, well, you know, why, just their example is if you are crossing a street because there's a Black man coming towards you, or you feel threatened physically because of a Black man, sort of naming that meta communication would be, why would you think that I would be aggressive or dangerous? So naming it, challenging the stereotype, asking for clarification, like, is this what you meant? And then to disarm the microaggression, you can express disagreement, you can state values and set limits in terms of, hey, we don't do that here. You can use an exclamation. It can be like, whoa, stop, we're not going there. Nonverbal communication, so saying, you know, shaking your head, walking away, leaving if necessary. Interrupting and redirecting conversation. You can educate the offender, so differentiating between intent and impact, appealing to the offender's values, like, hey, I know that you value this or that, but this is not what was conveyed in the message that you've sent. Promoting empathy, and then seeking external intervention. You can report to leadership if someone has committed a microaggression or repeatedly commits microaggressions. But you can also seek therapy and counseling, engage with a religious group, religious activity, spiritual activity, community, having a buddy system, a support group. Those are also other ways to kind of have that external intervention and support. A couple other strategies that I would like to advocate for. Yeah, so if we see color, I think we need to stop pretending that we want to aspire to some sort of colorblind society. That really, sometimes I have a hard time kind of expressing why it's a problem, but the fact is we do see color. And the problem is not that we see color, it's the value that we ascribe to people from different racial groups. And also, like, for a lot of people, their race or ethnicity is a part of their identity. So to not see that is to not see a huge part of that person. And as one of our participants has pointed out, colorblind equals, you know, being willfully blind to racism. Yes. Also, you can educate yourself. So there are lots of book lists that are kind of going around, especially right now, anti-racist book lists. For this particular graphic, I have slides later in the presentation where I've transcribed the authors and titles, if you want to check those out later. It's important for us as librarians to not only purchase these books for our collections, but to read them ourselves, to reflect on what we're learning from these books, but then to also sit with these ideas and the discomfort that is going to come up from these ideas. The biggest thing I think is listening. One of the things that I've definitely seen is a colleague who's a person of color will come and say, oh, hey, Susan said this thing to me that seemed really racist. And my initial reaction is like, oh, but Susan's always been really nice to me. Or I don't think Susan meant it that way. Surely she didn't mean it that way. And I think we really need to focus on not doing that, because that kind of immediate reaction really invalidates the experiences of our colleague. And then the chance of that they're going to come and share things with you again and have that kind of open, honest dialogue that we need is definitely going to be much less likely to happen. And one of the other things I think is going to be focusing on the ways that you can achieve connection, establish trust, and create relationships with each other. So rather than centering yourself or your own curiosity or your own desires about what you want someone to be or do, you're focusing on what that other person needs and how you're engaging with each other, instead of kind of trying to get somebody to fit in a box that you have for them. And in the words of, well, a paraphrase of April Hathcock, you're gonna make mistakes, you're gonna mess it up. There's really, if you're doing the work, you're gonna mess up, but you need to keep doing the work so that we can keep moving forward and we can make our profession better.
So hello again, this is Aubrey. So diversity matters. Why does diversity matters? That's a big one. As a group, we were talking about this, and it's really about being part of an inclusive organization in which we consider different perspectives, question assumptions, empower each other, share knowledge, keep growing. Diversity matters so that we can continuously improve our services and be relevant in supporting, engaging with the diverse populations that we serve. If we're not growing, if we're doing the same thing over and over and not changing, we're simply keeping the structure in place where many people are experiencing barriers and exclusion. So we have a lot of references and resources. We have a long list, so hopefully you'll take the time to go through our slides a little bit on your own. Now I guess it would be a great time to open up for questions or start a conversation. David, are there questions that come in?
Thank you all so much. We have had a few questions come in, and I encourage the attendees to continue adding them to the chat. There's also a discussion thread in ALA Connect. There's a community for the ACRL Together Wherever. You can continue the conversation there. To start, Aubrey, during your presentation, we had a couple questions that came up. One, talking about the persistent underrepresentation in the field. Is it an issue with hiring, or is it an issue with people choosing to go into the academic library field?
I'm sorry, David, can you repeat that once more?
Regarding persistent underrepresentation in the field, is that an issue with hiring, problem in the hiring process, or is it an issue with people choosing and being attracted to go into the academic library field?
I don't know. That's a very that's a hard one to answer. In terms of implicit intergroup bias, the hiring process really needs to be a big focus, because if the people on those committees are unaware of these implicit biases, then they're gonna bring those to the table when deciding on who's the better candidate. It really so for example, if you're ascribing leadership qualities with, I don't know, a white male, and this is happening on like a subconscious level, when you're meeting with that committee, that hiring committee, and you're talking about different candidates, that person might be, people might be inclined to give that male candidate a higher ranking, but not realizing that part of it's because of these implicit biases. So hiring practices are really important. So I hope that answered the question. I think that in terms of academic libraries in particular, I mean, it's not just the libraries themselves for which there's underrepresentation of diverse others. It's also within the university system at large, professors and other disciplines too. So there's this hierarchy in the university system, and we really need to make changes to make it more inclusive, for sure.
And this is Pam. I'd like to sort of throw something in also. I've been a librarian nearly 18 years, and we're just going to have to grapple, with the fact that in many cases, librarians are openly hostile to their colleagues of color, to Black, Indigenous people of color, to anyone who is marginalized. And if you sort of dive into our literature, you will find stories starting in the 50s and 60s. So I think some of it is a matter that people really need to engage with what people have been telling them, have been telling the profession for decades. And we're a reflection of what America is. We're going to be what our country is, what our communities are, and our profession needs to determine how we're going to start behaving in ways that are not actively hostile to marginalized communities.
All right, thank you both so much. Another one that came up during Jana's presentation about microaggressions, could you give some examples of calling in versus calling out and what some helpful wording could be?
I think that I still struggle with that one. From Thurber and D'Angelo's article, they have 3 different scenarios that they or vignettes that they write for you, or that they're sharing. For the one we're calling in as part of the principal, a white presenter and a Black presenter were doing like some diversity training. The Black presenter had asked white people, especially in the audience, to not interrupt during a portion of that. There was a white woman in the audience who did interrupt multiple times. And so the white trainer sort of checked in with her colleague and said, hey, do you want me to intervene here? Do you want me to speak up? Do you want me to say something? Her colleague said yes. So then she sort of paused the entire group and said, hey, we're going to use this as a learning moment. In that particular instance, she wasn't able to get the white woman who kept interrupting to be to sort of get back on board and to be open to that kind of feedback. But the rest of the participants in that group, both people of color and white participants, were able to move forward with the session. So I don't have, I feel like the calling in is always going to be a little bit hard, because it will depend on the person that you're interacting with and kind of what their level of kind of comfort or tolerance for being, I don't want to say like called out, that's not the point, but for bringing up like, hey, there's this thing that I would love to have you work on, or there's this thing that maybe didn't come across the way that you wanted it to. I do have a colleague who I think her approach is to be like, oh, so you said this and that kind of came across this way, but is that how you meant it? So then that can in some ways give that person like a heads up of, this didn't hit the way that you wanted it to, or didn't land the way that you wanted it to, and gives them kind of an option to be like, no, I definitely didn't mean that, I'm so sorry. And then you can kind of course correct from there.
All right, thank you all so much. Unfortunately, we are out of time. The Zoom room will remain open for another 20 minutes. If people want to continue to discuss in the chat, thank you so much to the presenters. You did a fantastic job today. This recording is going to be so valuable. And just as another reminder, both for this and all the other ACRL Together Wherever programs, there is a community set up in ALA Connect, where hopefully these discussions will continue much longer. Thank you so much.